I got on the airplane yesterday in Charlotte. We live part-time in Ocean Isle Beach, North Carolina. And then we live most of the time in Reno. And I always wear a cap on the airplane because of no hair, my head gets cold. And that picture they had up there, I didn't know I ever had hair. It's been so long. I still have that tie, though. Anyway, 25 years ago or something like that, our daughter, I bought an Iowa Hawkeyes cap, not this one, but another one. And we were going to Disney World, and I wore my cap. And she said, "Dad, that is the weirdest logo. Nobody will ever recognize what that is." We hadn't been at Disney World 5 minutes when some guy came up and said, "Go Hawkeyes." We then went to Europe a few years later, and Sue was with us, and I had another Hawkeyes cap on, and some guy in London on the street yelled, "Go Hawkeyes." So yesterday morning when I got on the airplane, it changed airplanes in Charlotte from Myrtle Beach to come to O'Hare and then to here. Sat down by a young man, and he said, "You from Iowa?" And I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "So am I." I said, "Where?" And he said, "West Union," which I believe is over by Decorah. And he had gone to school in South Dakota, but he grew up on a farm. And as I've told Bruce and Mike and Todd and others, you know, I am proud to be from Iowa. And I hope you are proud to be from Iowa as well. Because everywhere I go around the world, I find somebody that knows something about the Midwest or Iowa. And they always talk about the stability, the strength, the integrity of people from the Midwest. And I can tell you that has served me so well in my business career all these years. So I had the Iowa Hawkeyes hat on when we got out of the car. Chad Alley picked me up in Sioux City yesterday afternoon. And who's standing there but Mr. Mark, who said, "Hawkeyes, where's your Iowa State cap?" I said, "Nobody ever gave me one." So this morning he lived up to his promise, and I thank you for the hat, Mark. Mike, you've got a great team. I can tell a lot about what a meeting is going to be when we have our pre-conference call, as we did with you guys 3-4 weeks ago, and Lisa and Holly and Todd, and everybody was enthused, excited, and I know it's going to be a good meeting. You can just tell the difference. I was in New York 2.5 weeks ago. Didn't see that same energy, excitement, teamwork in New York City. There's something about the Midwest. It's something that we don't ever want to lose. It's a pride that we want to keep. I usually go online and when I'm going to speak and see what's happening in history. And today being June the 12th, it was kind of interesting. On this day in 1838, Iowa became a territory and then became a state in 1846, the 29th state, and on December the 28th. And the oldest city in Iowa, anybody know what that is? Dubuque. Yeah, I didn't know that. And on this day in 1839, the first baseball game was played in the United States. Probably the Cubs, I don't know. We're still Cubs fans, having lived in Chicago 3 different times. And Jack Brickhouse, the announcer, said one time when he was asked, "Why are the Cubs so bad?" he said, "Anybody can have a bad century." And, but they're on their second century now. In 1903, Niagara Falls in Ontario was incorporated as a city. In 1908, the Lusitania, big cruise ship, made its first crossing of the Atlantic. And then in 1915, it was making its 202nd crossing in May, and that was when it was hit by a German torpedo and sunk, and over 1,200 people lost their lives. On this day in 1931, Al Capone was indicted on 5,000 counts of prohibition and perjury. He could have gone down to Washington and done the same thing, I think. And on this day in 1942, a tornado killed 42 people in Oklahoma. I mean, what goes around just keeps coming around. And in 1948, Eddie Arcaro won the 80th Belmont Stakes race on a horse named Citation. So it was a busy day. And in 1975, Billy Williams hit his 400th home run on this day. George H.W. Bush is 89 today. Jim Nabors is 83. And on this day in 1994, Ron Goldman and O.J. Simpson's wife were murdered. So June 12th was a busy day. I didn't know that Iowa was the only state that starts with two vowels, I-O. I never thought about that. It's kind of some nonsense that, what do you do with it? I didn't know that Lake Okoboji is the largest natural lake in, or is the deepest natural lake in Iowa, 136 feet, and it's the longest at 16 miles. So, we're going to talk a little bit about leadership, ethics, importance of people in your organization, and then when I'm finished, we'll have time for some Q&A with you all and bring the lights up and so we can have a little closer visit. But after I had been at United for nearly 20 years, I was recruited to go down to this little airline in Texas that had 12 airplanes and 1,000 employees called Southwest Airlines. And that was the business plan for Southwest Airlines. You know, a lot of things have been written on cocktail napkins, but probably a lot of business plans too, but this one was done in 1966 or 67 in a bar in San Antonio, Texas, by a man named Rollin King, who you never heard of. His lawyer was a fellow named Herb Kelleher, and Herb had just finished handling Rollin's divorce, and they went across the street to the hotel to celebrate, I guess. And Rollin pulls out a cocktail napkin similar to this and draws a triangle and hands it across the table to Herb. And Herb said, "What's this?" And he said, "I think it's time to start a new airline in the state of Texas, a commuter airline like PSA in California." And Herb said, "What the hell are you telling me for? I'm a lawyer." He said, "That's what I need. I need an attorney to help me put this thing together." And as Herb Kelleher tells the story many years later, he said, "You know, after the first drink, I thought it was a lousy idea. But after the fourth drink, I said, sign me on." I think Herb is now 82, and so he's been there involved since 1967. And Herb is still working 60 hours a week. He's the chairman emeritus, still smoking 3 packs a day, has never exercised in his life that I'm aware of. Can drink a bottle of wild turkey a day if required. He's frequently required. But he had a passion. And I know many of you last year heard Jim Collins speak in Des Moines, and I guess that's how I ended up being here, because he talked a little bit about Southwest. But Jim Collins will tell you that people or organizations that have passion when they started, and then they have a clear vision as to where they're going, those are going to be the most profitable, most sustainable over the long term. And Southwest Airlines now, I think it was finally started flying in June of '71, so that they are 42 years old now, hard to believe. And they have 45,000 employees now with the acquisition of AirTran. They have made money now 40 years in a row. I mean, that's absolutely incredible for a real easy industry, but the airline industry is a tough industry to make money in. Last year, if you added up all the passenger airlines in the United States and divided in the profit up, they made 21 cents a passenger for all airlines. Now that includes United, which lost a ton after the merger, and Delta and American and so forth. Southwest, I think, was making around $4 a passenger, leading the pack. So when I was getting ready to leave United, it was announced, and the phone rang, and Linnea, my assistant in those days, said, "There's a man named Fred on the phone who says he has to talk to you." Now I have to back up 20 years. When Capital Airlines, who I started with loading bags in Chicago, was merged into United. United had all these psychologists and human resources, and so they interviewed all of us young bucks from Capital, and to see if we had the stuff to be able to stay with United after the merger. And if you've ever been involved in a merger, if you're the company that is acquired, you're going to be number 2. And we were number 2 at Capital. So I'm sitting across the desk from this man named Fred, and went through all the goals and so forth. And finally he said, tell me, young man, what's your long-term goal? And I said, I was about 23 years old. I want to be the president of the airline. And he laughed at me. And I didn't say anything. The years go by, and I never forgot it. You know, we all have mentors. Fred was my negative mentor. And every time I got a promotion, I would say, that's one more, Fred. I'm coming. I'm coming. So I would see him in the hallways once I became a vice president many years later in Chicago for United. I'd see Fred in the hallway. We'd say hello, all that. But the conversation never came up. And I always assumed he had forgotten it. I had not. But anyway, when Linnea came in and said, there's a man named Fred on the phone, I don't know his last name, I said, I know who it is. So I answered, and he told me his last name, which I remembered. He had retired a year or two before. But what I didn't know was he was dying of cancer. And he got on the phone, and he was in tears and crying. And he said, I've never forgotten our conversation. I was wrong. I owe you an apology. Congratulations. Clunk, hung up. And then he died about 2 months later. So it's funny how things go through life and things happen, or like you getting on the phone or on the email with Bonnie Brown. Sometimes things have a way, I think, fate, you may call it fate, whatever you want, but it has a way of happening that it never expected. I never expected to be speaking for 23 years now. I've had 4 careers. And the first career we have all shared in this room. That's from the time we were born until you leave home and go to college or go to work. And that was the most important career in my life, growing up here in Iowa. The second career was airlines. The third career was an entrepreneur, starting companies in Texas. And then I've been on the speaking circuit for 20-some years now. So somehow in life, things play out. And I think you made a statement about being an attorney in Gainesville, Florida, and running for Congress and barely not winning. Changed your life and brought you then back to Iowa into the community college thing. So let's talk about some of that, and if we can throw a slide up for me. Leadership strategies through turbulent times. Sounds kind of like an omnibus title. And I always say something about our military when I speak, and obviously that's the Blue Angels flying over the Statue of Liberty. And living in Reno, Nevada for 19 years now, I served on the board of the Reno Air Races for many years. That's the shuttle Endeavor going home to Los Angeles a few months ago. But at the Reno Air Races, this was taken, I think, 4 years ago. And there are 3 very important people in that photo. One is my wife on the far right. And next to her is Vice Admiral Mark Fox. And next to him is a retired colonel who had just retired the week or 2 before this was taken. And if I tell you the name, which I will, Mark Tillman, you would say, who's he? Colonel Mark Tillman was the commander of Air Force One for George Bush for 8 years and has some tremendous stories to tell. So I've stayed in touch with them, and most recently with Admiral Fox, who he was based in Fallon, Nevada when this was taken, running Top Gun in the Naval Air Station. And then he went on to Bahrain and was in charge of the 5th Fleet for the past 2 years. He was the one who called the shots, it was probably a year and a half ago. You remember when the Somali pirates captured some Iranian fishermen? And Mark Fox and I would email, and he's 12 hours time difference from me. But I got up one morning and I had an email from Admiral Fox, and I figured it out. He had sent it at 3 o'clock in the morning in Bahrain time. And I thought, what was he doing up in the middle of the night? And then I found out later that was the night that they took in the folks from the 5th Fleet and they rescued those 15 Iranian sailors without anybody getting hurt. So he was calling the shots. And when I emailed him back and said, I think I figured out why you were up in the middle of the night. It wasn't insomnia. And of course, he couldn't tell me anything because of it being classified. And he said, yeah, you're probably right. So Mark is going to come to Philadelphia next month when we have the National Speakers Association convention. He's at the Pentagon now. and he's going to come speak to a group that we have, which we call Speaking Eagles, professional speakers that have aviation in their background. So some very important patriots in our lives, and for those of you who have served, and those of you who have relatives who have served or are serving now, never a day goes by we shouldn't be so thankful for what these young men and women do for us. God bless America. That was me with the little cap on. Maybe that's where I learned how to wear a cap, I don't know. And our neighbors across the road on Highway 2 west of Bedford, Dean and Doris Spencer, and they're twins. And I haven't heard from Doris in many years, but I still hear from Dean, and he retired as an air traffic controller several years ago and lives in Olathe, Kansas. But that was my dad's B John Deere, and that's where I got my start in the farming. And then by the time we were into high school, my dad became very ill, and we had to sell the farm and move into the edge of town. And they ran a Conoco gas station. This happens to be Shelley. I couldn't find a Conoco one on the internet, but it looked identical to this. And we had regular and we had ethyl. And I think the regular was 18 cents a gallon and the ethyl was 22 cents a gallon in those days. So I worked in the gas station after school and in the evenings and for 50 cents a day. And then on Saturdays I'd go down and I worked at the Hy-Vee food store bagging groceries, and I got 50 cents an hour there. So much better deal. So Dad, we still lived on the farm west of Bedford. He got the urge to learn how to fly after World War II. And he had taken a ride with somebody else, and it got him. So he convinced my mother that if he sold enough cows and pigs, he could get $600 and go buy an old Piper Cub that looked something like that one. And it didn't even have any brakes. Why they ever built an airplane with no brakes is beyond me, but they did. So the first day that he landed on the farm, he had soloed over in Clarinda, Julie. And he brought the airplane home, and as he's taxiing up, my mom and two sisters and I are out there. We're applauding this great occasion. And I'm thinking, this is kind of ironic. We don't have any electricity. We don't have any indoor plumbing. We don't have any hot water. But we got an airplane out in the pasture. So I knew then aviation was my passion. And Dad taught me how to fly, and by the time I was 16, I soloed and assumed that I would go on and be a pilot. I didn't want to go to college after I got out of high school. I told Rob this before. My passion was aviation, and I was going to fly airplanes or have something to do with aviation. And I went to Chicago and for $200 a month started loading bags at Midway Airport, and then worked my way up and tried to enlist and fly helicopters. And then I found out I'm colorblind. So that was when I made the decision, okay, if I can't go in that direction, I want to be the president of an airline. And never dreaming that someday I'd have the opportunity to be the CEO of two airlines. So the years go by, and our son, that was Dad in another airplane we had, a Piper Vagabond. The years go by, and that's our son Mike, who's a captain for U.S. Air back in Charlotte. We lived in the Chicago area, and I taught Mike how to fly, just like my dad did until he needed an instructor. And so he then goes on to Oklahoma State University and got his bachelor's degree and all of his flying credentials, and they had a big flying program there. When he came home one weekend to Texas, he proudly said he had his instructor's rating. And I hadn't flown in 5 years. And we'd just been taking Brandon through bankruptcy, and I was all stressed out. But I told Krista, my wife, his mother, how many dads get to teach their son how to fly? Then the years go by, the roles change. Son could take Dad out, check him out, sign his logbook. That'd be pretty neat. He agreed to do it, so we went over to Addison Airport north of Dallas, got a Cessna 172, went out, flew for 3 hours, did landings, takeoffs, and all this. And I remember I was soaking wet in my shirt, but I thought I was doing a pretty good job. And I was so stressed out that I probably didn't belong in an airplane. Anyway, we landed, pulled back up to the gas pump. I opened the glove compartment, pulled out my logbook and handed it to him to sign. And he pushed it back and he said, I'm not signing that. You're not safe to fly by yourself. So, Mike, I said what any loving father would say to his son. Screw you, you're out of the will. I haven't flown since. But that was the little airline I started with, Capital Airlines in Chicago, and after I found out how cold it was going to be on the ramp loading bags, I quickly became a ticket agent for the wintertime. And one of our deals was when we posted flight information in those days, you had the little white letters that you stuck up on the board, and our flight information was not very accurate. I'm not sure it's very accurate today either, but anyway, there was a limousine driver named John who came and picked up all the new stewardesses, or Julie, you flew. You said you were a hostess, and Krista, my wife, was a stewardess for Capital. But in exchange for giving John, the limo driver, accurate flight information, so he'd know when to pick the young ladies up, he would give us phone numbers of all the new stewardesses that came to town. So then we would call up and invite ourselves over for coffee. And in those days, nobody even drank a beer, I don't think. And we'd invite ourselves over for coffee, and that's how I met my wife, Krista, and we were married about a year later and over 50 years now. So it's been a great relationship, a great partner. And that's Krista in the middle, and that's the other part of our family, our daughter, Sue. Sue had a significant birthday here in March, and we were in North Carolina, so she was kind of perturbed that we were going to miss this significant birthday. What she did not know was we had planned a surprise party, and we flew back to Reno. And we had about 50 of her closest friends there when she came into the room. And so she had no idea we were in town or that there was a party at all. But the other piece is that Sue has always been afraid of clowns all of her life. So what did we do? We hired a clown to be there. So she's wearing the clown hat, and she will never forget that birthday, I don't think. And then Capital was merged into United, as I mentioned, and we worked our way up via Cleveland and San Francisco and Chicago and a few other places unknown. But what I learned throughout all this, and especially taking Braniff through chapter 11, is that turbulence was inevitable. Misery was optional. Every day was a bad day taking an airline through bankruptcy. When you've got a company that has 10,000 employees, $1 billion in revenue, over 100 airplanes, you're flying to 9 countries, and when we got there, we figured out we only had 10 days of cash. That'll bring a lump to your throat. And I've just been recruited to leave Southwest to go from the world's most profitable airline to the world's least profitable airline, and we figure out we got 10 days of cash. So I made a bad decision. I shouldn't have gone. And we all make bad decisions in life, and you got to figure out how to compensate for it, how to make the turbulence work for you instead of against you. And that's where the inevitable but misery is optional came from. But the one thing I did do right is I took my CFO, Phil Guthrie, with me from Southwest, and we went as a team to try to save Braniff. And we also got the agreement of both of our wives before we ever did it, that it was very risky, but it was even more risky than we had anticipated. So my advice is, if you ever do something as crazy as that, don't go by yourself. Take somebody with you. And Phil and I, to this day, we're still good friends and still working together on various projects and all. He still lives in Dallas. Turbulence is a great opportunity. During this past recessionary time, a lot of folks have had a lot of turbulence, as you know, but a lot of folks have found ways to make a lot of money and improve the value of their lives and the contribution they make. And the value of preparation and anticipation of the future is key. Preparation, prepare, train, just what you're doing here. Learn. ABI is a great organization. And you're fortunate to be able to have these networking opportunities and learn from each other. Take advantage, suck it all up as much as you can. And then when the time to perform arrives, the time to prepare is past, too late. So you got to be ready for it. And I think the best example of that for me is when Captain Sully Sullenberger landed that Airbus in the Hudson River about 3.5 years ago. He had even had glider training early in his career. never knowing that it was an Airbus that was going to be his glider. But he landed in the river, which nobody had ever done before. He had never even thought of it until they had an opportunity, or until they had no other opportunity available to them. He had to do it. And I listened to the cockpit conversations a while back between he and his co-pilot, Jeff. And the captain said to Jeff, "Have you got any ideas?" Years ago, that wouldn't have happened. When we were in a command and control, the captain, his word is God, you would never ask the co-pilot for advice, nor would he or she ever be allowed to give you some advice. But he did. And Jeff says very quietly, "No." So Solly then said, "Tell the tower we're going to land in the Hudson." And he did successfully. Well, since that time, our son Mike, who I mentioned flies for U.S. Air, tells me they've changed the overwater training and ditching procedures at U.S. Air, and I thought you'd like to see how they're doing it now. I showed that in Dublin, Ireland a while back at a big aviation finance conference, and I didn't know there was a VP of U.S. Air in the audience. He wasn't too happy with me after he saw that. Now, here's a guy who understands turbulence very well. He was flying out of Anchorage, Alaska, into the backcountry to go fishing. And that's a Super Cub, a fabric Piper Cub of a more modern era. But he left his cooler with the bait in it inside the airplane when he went to fish, and a big bear came and just tore that airplane apart to get to the cooler. Look at his wheels. But the guy he had creativity. He was not going to let turbulence get him down. So he radioed a buddy back in Anchorage and said, "Here's what I need you to fly out with. I need 3 cases of duct tape and 2 wheels." And a few hours later, the guy showed up, and here's what he did. He wrapped his airplane in duct tape and then flew it out of there and flew it back to Anchorage. So he gets my award for creativity through turbulent times. And we always think of turbulence as happening with airplanes. That's at the Reno air races where those jets are going over 500 miles an hour around the pylons. Or this young man that flies this with Strega, he's only 24, 25 years old. And so he's pulling 7 and 8 Gs when he's going over 500 miles an hour. And he's been the champion airplane for the last 3 to 4 years. But turbulence happens to you and me every day. We just don't look at it in the same way that we would as an airplane, or what Captain Sully did. I took that picture at the air races just last September. If you can see, the gentleman in the center has 2 prostheses. Both of his legs are gone. His name's Dana Bowman. He was part of the Army's elite Golden Knights parachute team, maybe, 10, 15 years ago. And he and his partner skydived, and were doing their aerobatics before they pulled the chutes, and they got out of sync, and the partner hit him at over 100 miles an hour and took both of Dana's legs right off in the air, and the partner died. But somehow Dana, and he still doesn't know how it happened, he was able to get his chute open. He landed, and he has had the prosthesis, and he's still jumping 400 and 500 times a year and does speaking. So when you get up in the morning and you think, I got a muscle cramp that hurts a little bit, put it in perspective. Turbulence is inevitable, misery is optional. And the fellow in the middle is another one of my heroes. We had him to the races last year to speak. That's Charlie Plum in the middle, Captain Charlie Plum, who spent 7 years in the Hanoi Hilton as a POW in Vietnam. Nicest guy. And when Charlie speaks on stage, and I've seen him several times, and I tear up every time, he puts a chair here, and he puts another chair here 6 feet away. And then he starts walking back between them. And he does that for about a minute. And then he tells you that was his cell for 7 years. That's all the space he had. So a great aviator, a great friend, and a great American patriot. There's a young man in New York named Simon Sinek who I met several years ago. And he wrote this book about 3 years ago called Start With Why. And he interviewed me for the book. And his point is, much like Jim Collins said, those companies that have passion start with why. Most of us start with, what are we going to do? What are we going to sell? How are we going to do it? But those like Rollin King on the napkin, the triangle for Southwest, the vision, the passion, or like Apple Computer. And Simon says that Apple has successfully challenged conventional thinking. The reason is simple. Apple inspires. Now, he wrote this 3 years ago when Steve Jobs was still alive. Apple has changed today. If you watch what's happening with them, they're starting to have to play a little bit of catch-up. And they just announced some new stuff in the last day or two. So Samsung has really gone to work with the new phone. Steve Jobs was not a people person. And the more we read about him and learn about him, he was a tough guy to work for. If you remember, he got fired from Apple many years ago and was gone for 12 years, and then they brought him back. But he had the passion. He understood technology and what it could do for you and me. Just like Sam Walton did with Walmart, of what Herb Kelleher has done all these years with Southwest. So if you look at organizations, or what Warren Buffett has done, which is amazing as well. But if you look at organizations, Simon says, you'll find there was somebody there that had that passion, somebody that said, why? And then you'll get innovation. There's really three kinds of innovation, according to Harvard, and incremental, which is really what government is. That's the way it was structured to be. But then I would say Southwest fit the second category of disruptive. It wasn't an original idea. We copied the idea from PSA in California, but changed the way the game was played and made it work. And then finally you get the revolutionary, and you find someone like Apple. And turbulence has stages as well, and Dr. Don Beck in Denton, Texas helped me with this when we wrote the book a few years ago. We all want to be in the alpha state, and that's the blue skies. That's where everything is going well in our own personal lives and at the office. But that doesn't happen very often. Every day there's something you hadn't planned for. So you move into the beta state, you go into the thunderstorms, and you go back and forth. That's okay. That gives you the opportunity to go to the next state up there, the flex state, where you can get innovation and make changes under pressure or under the recession, whatever it is. Excuse me. Those airplanes on 9/11, they were all in alpha when they took off from Boston and Kennedy and Dulles. Skies were blue, tanks were full, radars working, the crews rested. And then the terrorists came out of the cabin, and they immediately went into the beta state. And they had an opportunity to innovate, but we didn't know the rules of the game had changed. We didn't know they were killers. We have all been trained in the airline industry up until that time that they're hijackers. They want money. You negotiate. So had they understood, and finally that last airplane, the United airplane, Flight 93 over Pennsylvania, they got word that these guys you can't reason with, and that's when they said, let's take them down. Then it was too late, and the airplane crashed. So unfortunately, all those airplanes ended up in Gamma, the pits. But they didn't have an opportunity to come back. Braniff was in the pits, bankruptcy. But we had an opportunity to stay there, reorganize it, get it back out, sold it to the Pritzker family in Chicago, and got some of the creditors paid back, the secured creditors. The unsecured, of course, did not get more than 4 cents on the dollar. And we got some 3,000 employees back to work out of the 10,000. So we did it with a fresh start, going through Omega and then to the new Alpha. So if you can figure out what stage of turbulence you're in, it will make your decision-making process a lot easier to evaluate the external and internal factors. Now, Dr. Beck being I shouldn't say a typical academician, but being an academician, instead of calling these stages of turbulence 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, he gave them all Greek letter names, the alpha, beta, gamma, omega, etc. Just to make it sound a little fancier, I guess. But I told him there was one Greek letter he couldn't use, delta. So I did a little interview with Todd that he sent around to many of you, and cousin Julie here emailed me that when she listened to it, I had said that in turbulent times, it's important that you simplify, simplify, simplify. And I gathered you were in your home office when you replied to me, and Julie said she looked around and said, I got a lot of work to do here to get things organized and simplified. Prioritize, simplify. I learned taking Braniff through bankruptcy, you didn't have time to get committees, consultants, and whatever together and figure out what you were going to change. When you got 10 days of cash with $1 billion company, you got to go on your instincts and the best facts that you have and make a decision. I learned then that when you want to go do something of cost cutting, don't go to every department and say, I need 5% reduction. It will happen, but it's just like cancer, it'll probably come back. So what I did is I just went in and took out entire departments. Braniff had 50 vice presidents when we got there. That was part of their problem. So I took out 22 vice presidents in 1 week and all the staff that worked for them, which was another 600 or 700 people. Did away with the functions completely. And my thought was, and it worked, if we really have done away with an important function, it'll show up here pretty soon, and then we'll figure out somebody else has got to take on that responsibility. But you really got to keep the thumb on it, otherwise it just gets away from you when you don't have time. So simplify, simplify, simplify. And that's what I told Herb Kelleher when we agreed to leave United and go to Southwest. I said, you all have started something here really creative. The company was 7 years old then. Something really creative. Are you willing to continue down this path, which is pretty unorthodox from what the rest of the industry is doing? If you are, if you're willing to change the way the game is played, then I'll be a part of it. If you're going to go back to the old way of doing business, then I'm going to stay at United. And Herb and I shook hands, and he said, we're going to change the way the game is played. And obviously Southwest has. There's a man that's changed the way the game is played for our country. I took this picture in 1981. I was sitting in the nose of a B-29, the only one that's still flying, Fifi. And we were in Harlingen, Texas at the what was then called the Confederate Air Force mock bombing runs. But the man flying that airplane with the headset on is none other than General Paul Tibbets, who dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. And when we got off the airplane that day, we shook hands, and he said, thank you for what you're trying to do to save Braniff. And I said, sir, that is so insignificant. Think what you did to save our country. And he said, it was just my job, and turned around and walked away. And there's a guy that changed the way the game is played. He didn't know it. His name was D.B. Cooper. If you remember when he jumped out of an airplane 40 years ago. He's never been found. So all kinds of speculation has been gone on all these years. But we didn't have security before he did that. He created a whole new industry. We began to check IDs and whether you bought tickets with cash. And then that led to the magnetometers, and we began to see what you were carrying in your pockets and in your luggage. One man changed the way the game is played. And that was the first hijacking then we had in Reno. I lived in San Francisco and was the regional vice president for United, and Reno was one of our stations. That's what got us starting to go up there, where we ended up living there. But it was on a Friday night, and we had a copycat hijacking after D.B. Cooper. And the station manager, Bob Gardner, called, and it was about 5 o'clock. And he said, the only bank in Reno is closed. We had one giant bank in those days, and the vault was locked until Monday. And he said, this guy rode out on the tarmac on a bicycle, with a .22 rifle across the handlebars, put the kickstand down, went up the stairs, pointed the rifle at one of the flight attendants and said, get me $200,000 or an hour, or I'm going to kill all of you. So Bob Gardner, now the manager in Reno, he's got a real dilemma. Where does he find $200,000 on a Friday night when the one bank is closed? So he called me, and he was all excited, and I couldn't do anything in San Francisco. And I said, Bob, we got to be creative. There must be a way to find money in Reno, Nevada. And he said, I got it. And he hung up. He called 2 casinos. He called Harold's Club and Harrah's and said, I need $200,000 within an hour. So one of our longtime friends was at Harold's Club, a man named Roy Powers. And Bob called him and said, I need all you can spare. Howard and I'll will assure you that you'll get paid back. And Roy, years later, told me that, he said, you know, having had met you and learning that you were from Iowa, he said, I figured Bob's word would be good for both of you. And it was. So this slide, if you can read it, it was another cocktail napkin. And it says, received from Harold's Club $150,000, $150,000 in $100 bills. And it's signed by two people. It's signed by an FBI agent, Harold somebody, and then it was signed by one of our supervisors, Wayne Duvall. And that's all Roy Powers and Harold's Club had until we found the guy. He jumped out over south of Reno, and they captured him, and they found his car hidden in the woods, and the dummy, his license plate said parachute. So it was kind of logical that it might be his vehicle that they were finding. But they've changed the way the game is played. That was Felix Baumgartner jumping out at 128,000 feet just a few months ago, if you remember seeing that on the internet. He practiced, trained for years in order to do this. And then he free fell, faster than the speed of sound. It changed the way the game is played, just as little old Southwest has done it. So I realized when I got there as the second CEO that we had to do three things, and Herb and the board agreed. We had to put the vision down on a piece of paper. They'd been doing pretty well for 7 years, but it was a really ad hoc operation. There was no plan. There was no budgeting. I asked the vice president of flight operations, Don Ogden, I said, I'd like to sit down and go through your budget. And he said, we don't have a budget. We just don't spend any money unless we have to. When they wanted to buy an airplane, I asked the controller. They didn't even have a CFO. I said, how do you decide when you're going to buy a new airplane? He said, and he was a good old Texas boy. He said, when we get enough money, we go up to Boeing and negotiate, and we buy an airplane. And I said, and how do you decide how you're going to deploy the resource? And those words were a little too big for him, and his eyes kind of rolled around. And I said, where are you going to fly the airplane? He said, you weren't listening. When we get enough cash, we go buy an airplane, and then when we get back home, we all sit down and figure out where we're going to fly it. Well, you can't run your business that way. So one, I knew I had to get the vision on a piece of paper. Two, we had to figure out what business were we really in? And I think this is a good question for all of you. What is the ultimate value and service that you provide? Not what the business is, but what's the ultimate value? What's the outcome that you're doing? You may say that you're in the electric business. Well, that's the product, that's the what, but you're giving people heat, cool, security, entertainment, and the list goes on and on. And it's important that people that work for you understand what business you're really in. And then finally, it's the safety part, the innovation. That's going to come out of the culture. That's going to come out of the people. So what's the vision? What's the business that you're in? And then what kind of a culture is going to support your value proposition or your service? And Simon also said if you sell a product or a service, you're just going to be known as a vendor or a supplier. But if you sell a vision or an experience, now you can develop a brand. I'm convinced that you can develop a brand out of anything. And being Cubs fans, we go down to spring training once in a while, and I'm not sure I brought the card with it, but there's a young man that sells beer at Hohokam Park in Mesa, Arizona for the last 20 years during this preseason. He's from St. Paul, Minnesota. His name is Mark. I have no idea what his last name is, but he has branded himself as Mark the Beer Guy. He's just selling beer. He's 6'8", he weighs 280 pounds. He carries 2 big plastic buckets of bottled beer. He has his picture taken with kids and ladies, and he's throwing peanuts and stuff. People are lined up to buy beer from Mark. And I just looked the other day to see if his website was still there, and it is, markthebeerguy.com. And he's got plasticized business cards that list all the events that he's sold beer at over the years. He makes over $100,000 a year just going around selling beer out of buckets, a commodity that he has turned into a brand. And Mark has to be getting in his upper 50s, I would think, now. But he has the vision, and he has developed the brand. So I took the little team off of Southwest. We only had 8 or 9 of us, including Herb Kelleher. And we went to a college in Richardson, Texas, and got a conference room. And I facilitated it and said, we're not going to leave this room until we can write up on the wall in 100 words or less, what are we going to be when we grow up as Southwest Airlines? And we argued back and forth for 10 hours the first day. And then we took them all out to our house and we had a cookout. And everybody got relaxed. And we went back again the next morning. And within 30 minutes, it came to us all together, I think, as a group. And I'm so glad it did. It wasn't my idea. But they said, wait a minute, we're not an airline. We're in mass transportation. That's the business we're in. We're a cattle car. Our goal is to increase the size of the pie, increase the size of the market, get people out of the living rooms, make it affordable to fly, get you out of your automobiles, make it comparable to driving that you can pay the same amount and fly. And that was a revelation. That was important. So then we wrote this little vision statement. It's 52 words long. I had a college professor tell me one time, Rob, that's the worst mission statement he'd ever read in his life. He said, it's kind of tactical. The grammar is not too good. He said, who wrote that? And I said, I did. But I said, I don't care. It worked. And for the next year after we wrote that little vision, I spent 30 to 40% of my time out doing nothing but one-on-ones in bag rooms, cockpits, reservation offices, Wall Street, customers at airports, investment community, pounding that little vision into the fabric of the organization. And that's where it became what Jim Collins was talking about last year, and which we'll talk about here in just a few minutes. But that was the original uniforms. And I couldn't figure out for a while when I left big old stodgy United and went to Southwest why everybody was happy. There were no complaints. The uniform was an important part of the culture at Southwest. And we copied that from PSA in California as well. It turned out that most all of the young ladies at the beginning, and we only had female flight attendants at that time, had been cheerleaders, drum majorettes, baton twirlers in college. They were in show business or high school. Many of them just went to high school. They were in show business. They knew they were going to look good in the uniform when they came to apply for the job. So we had the people department sit down with a group of them. That was the first graduating class, 1971. And two of those young ladies, I'm told, are still flying today, 41 years later. I don't know which two. But we had the people department interview a lot of them to see what we could figure out. And here's what we came up with. We came up with this personality profile, which Southwest still uses today to hire everybody, not just flight attendants. But the number one thing was attitude. And Chad and I were talking about this in the car coming over here yesterday. I said, too often I think we put too much emphasis on the resume. We started with attitude at Southwest. If you hire an attitude, you can develop their skills. And it doesn't make any difference whether it's a pilot, a reservations agent, whatever. You hire a bad attitude, you're stuck with it. You probably are not going to change it. So attitude was number one and still is today. They were all cheerful, all optimistic. They had great decision-making ability. They loved customers. That's where all the fun stuff begins to form out of this. Team spirit, great communicators, a lot of self-confidence, self-starters. Don't tell them what to do. Frame it for them that this is the direction we're going, and then let them go do it. And then bite your tongue that things won't go too bad the other direction. We had one flight attendant, in fact, she just called me last month. She's 59 years old now and wanted me to be a reference for her on a job. But her name was Cindy, and Cindy was our flight attendant of the year. She got more good letters than anybody I'd ever seen. She got more bad letters than anybody I'd ever seen because she was very profane, and she would not hesitate to use some profanity to make her point with the customer. And most of the time, she got away with it, but once in a while, she wouldn't. But if you're going to give people that latitude, you can't slap them on the hands. Once you say, I want you to innovate, I want you to have fun in the job, I want you to interact with customers, I want you to make the decisions on a complaint, you own it, don't pass the buck up to somebody else, go ahead, we'll trust your judgment. But once you say that, you better live up to it. Otherwise, it'll go in the other direction real quick. And I still get emails all the time from people telling me they just had an experience on Southwest and This was one, if any of you have ever been to New York and been to the Blue Man show down in Lower Manhattan, they pass toilet paper back through the audience, and you try to get it passed on to the next row behind you without tearing it. So this young lady got on the PA and said that she only had enough drinks for half the airplane. And so she was going to have a contest, and whichever side got the roll of toilet paper unwound on their side would get all the drinks. Well, that was a pretty powerful motivator to those people. So here, this side on the right side of the aisle has just completed it successfully, and they're all cheering. And she gets on the PA and says, "I was just kidding. I got enough drinks for all of you anyway." But see, that story became folklore, and people began to tell it. There's another story that I really don't think is true, but we all repeat it. But it's to the flight attendant that got up and hid in the overhead bins one time. And when the first passenger opened the door to put his bag up there, she, I don't know what she said, boo, whatever. But I don't know whether that story ever happened or not. But some of these stories are so good, you've got to just keep telling it. And folklore is important in your organization. There will be stories, Mike, that will come out of this conference that people will tell for years. When I was at the ABI conference at Lake Okoboji, yada, yada, yada. You want that to happen. That's good. I had one in Reno, a year ago. I was going from Reno to Las Vegas early one morning, and everybody's kind of grumpy and they want their coffee. And the male flight attendant, before we were pushed back from the gate, gets on the PA and said, "Before we do the safety announcement, I want to call your attention to our flight attendant in the middle of the aisle here, Julie." And we all look, and here is this very attractive, well-groomed flight attendant, Julie. And he said, "Julie is my ex-wife." He said, "She's a great lady, but the alimony is just killing me. And if any of you have any interest, just push your call button." I counted, 9 guys pushed their call button. My arm was going up. Well, he immediately changed the culture, the attitude, the atmosphere on that airplane. And I've had more people tell me that story, and I know they weren't even on the airplane, but I was. But I continue to tell the story myself as well. That was when I was there, and we had a steak and beans contest, and that's Herb Kelleher sitting over on the far side. And we started service to Oklahoma City and Tulsa from Dallas on the same day. And so I took one city, and he took the other, and whichever one boarded the most passengers in the first 30 days, I think it was, they got to be treated to a steak dinner. And the losing team, which turned out to be my team, we had to eat beans, and I've got a prisoner's outfit and a ball and chain on, and I had to get down on my hands and knees and cut up Kelleher's steak for him and go get his drinks, which was a full-time job. But people love it when the CEO makes an ass out of himself. And that story continues to be told. Kelleher on the drinking part, if he were here, he would tell you the same stories. In fact, if Herb were here, he would probably be smoking right now, and if the smoke alarms were in here, they'd probably be going off. He's amazing. But anyway, we were in New York when I was there, and we were trying to raise money on Wall Street. So we had a meeting with the analysts. I would take along a flight attendant in one of those uniforms like I showed you, and a pilot, and that would get in uniform, and that would get the attention of the old analysts. And then we would have a Q&A with the analysts on what they had heard about this new airline idea, mass transportation, et cetera. And one of the things we did in the early days is we didn't charge for drinks during the daytime, because the majority of you flying then were business travelers and you didn't drink anyway. It was just easier to give it away. So this one old analyst has given me a rough time about how much money we're wasting giving away the drinks. And American doesn't do that, and United doesn't do that, and on and on. And he finally said, "Give me an example." He said, "How long does it take to fly from Dallas to Houston?" And I said, 55 minutes. "Well, how many free drinks could you get in 55 minutes? I said, "Well, the record is 7 Jack Daniels and water, and it's held by our chairman here." Herb said, "7? I thought I had 8. I just made it up on the spur of the moment. And Gary Kelly is carrying the tradition on. That's Gary there dressed up as the Hairspray character. And every every Halloween, the employees decide what Gary is going to dress up as, and then he goes out and flies the airline for a day and serves peanuts. And then the next year, he was ZZ Top. And I don't have a photo, but I think last year he was the Toy Story 3. He was the big cowboy with the hat on. Now here's a 57-year-old man, a finance major, CEO and chairman of the airline, and he's still willing to get out and have the fun. And that's Gary there, and that's our neighbor in Reno, Melinda Gibbons. And Melinda's husband happens to be a UPS captain. But when Gary first became the CEO, he and I were emailing back and forth, and I was the second CEO and he was the fifth. So we just started signing our emails, number 2 and number 5. And we thought that was kind of fun. And he came to Reno a few months later to make a speech, and I went to hear him. He had called me number 2 for so long, he forgot my name. So from the podium, he said, I want to introduce number 2 is here today. And of course, everybody looked around, what's number 2? So we had fun with that for a while until the governor of New York was ousted, if you remember, 2 or 3 years ago. And he was named as client number 9 in the call girl ring down in Washington, D.C. And my wife, Krista, who's much smarter than I, said, you and Gary may want to rethink your 2 and 5 thing. So I had made the mistake of telling our neighbor Melinda that story, and Gary and I stopped using the 2 and the 5. So she was on a flight with him a few months ago as a passenger, and he was a passenger from Phoenix to Orlando. And she waited till everybody got off the airplane and he was coming up the aisle, and she said, how's it going, number 5? And of course he turned around because he didn't know that very few people knew that. So then she told him that she was our neighbor, and she said, now I want a picture taken with you. So it runs through the organization from top to bottom, sideways, every department. It's an amazing thing that they've been able to keep that culture going as long as they have. I mentioned Jim Collins, and how many of you were in Des Moines last year and heard Jim speak? Oh, a lot of you. I have never met Jim Collins. I don't know him. We have never talked by phone. And when this book came out in December of 2011, I think, a publisher called me and said, you need to read Great by Choice. And I said, why? He said, I'll send you a copy. You'll see. So he sent the book, and I read it. And of course, he devoted almost all of chapter 6 to talking about Southwest Airlines and what we did. Jim Collins' research is, I'll tell you, I've never seen anything better. His comments on me, the speeches I made, what he quoted me on, are 100% accurate. And I'm sure he had a lot of his graduate students that were helping him do this. But it was over 9 years of research that went into it with all the companies that they looked at. And what his point was on us, for those of you that weren't in Des Moines last year, is that for over 30 years, Southwest Airlines has stayed with at least 80% of that little vision statement that I showed you before. They haven't strayed from the basic. And I think the lesson for all of you with small businesses and large businesses, what really works in your company? What is your core business? And don't change it with every economic downturn. The stuff that's not working, throw it out, but stay the course. And Southwest has so far done that 80%. Now, buying AirTran is a big move, but Gary Kelly looked at the culture of the people of AirTran before he looked at it as a financial transaction. And too many mergers, as you know, are based on a financial transaction, and then finally somebody says, what the hell's wrong with morale around here? And nobody is even paying attention. I think the United Airlines Continental merger is probably a pretty good example of that. The cultures were not meshed together to begin with. They're finally beginning to make some traction, get some traction now. But for a long while, I stayed away from United and just avoided them whenever I could. So that was what he said, called it the Putnam list. It's the things that we thought were very important after airline deregulation. And the only one on that list that they've changed is they're no longer just a short-haul carrier. They're flying coast to coast, and pretty soon they're going to be flying to Hawaii and Mexico and the Caribbean, it looks like, as well. But it's still the same no-frills concept. No meals, no first class, no seat assignments, etc. and we have to train you. In the early days, they had 4 airplanes before I got there, and they were running out of cash. And Lamar Muse, who was the first, I want to back that up. Lamar Muse, who was the first CEO before I was there, came to his little group one day and he said, here's the deal. The other airlines are trying to put us out of business here at Love Field, and they're trying to do it before the government will step in. And he said, I'm going to run out of cash, so I'm going to sell 1 airplane to get cash to stay in business. So we're going to go from 4 airplanes down to 3. But I want to fly the same number of flights with 3 airplanes as we've been flying with 4. Now, I've got another meeting to go to. You all figure out how to do it. And Lamar told me years later, he didn't have a clue. But as an entrepreneur, he had the intuition and the smarts to know, I got to get cash and I got to get the productivity up. Now think about it. If you could go back after this conference to your business and cut out 25% of your asset base, your investment, and run the same amount of revenue through the pipeline, the bottom line is going to explode. And that's exactly what has happened to Southwest Airlines. And that's still the advantage they have today, is that productivity and their people. So they sat around this little table at Love Field, and looking at each other about how do you figure out to fly the same number of flights with 3 airplanes as we did with 4? Can't fly any faster, can't fly any earlier in the morning, can't fly any later at night. Bill Franklin finally figured it out, the VP of Customer Service. There's only one place to do it, and that's on the ground. And he said, I think if we shorten those turnaround times from 20 minutes or 25 to 10, we can fly the same number of flights with 3 airplanes as we did with 4. And then they all look at each other and say, how do you turn a 737 with 118 passengers on, fuel the airplane, bags off, bags on, passengers off, passengers on, clean up the airplane? How do you do that in 10 minutes? And that's when they began to experiment. And we figured out if we didn't give you a seat assignment, but we could train you, that in those days we numbered the seats from 1 to 118. Excuse me, now they do it A, B, and C. But if we could train you to get to the airport early and get a low number, you would get over there in line with a knot in your stomach with that first group of cattle ready to run down that jetway to get the seat of your choice. And it speeded up the process. We learned if we took out the garment bag racks and you had no place to hang up your garment bag, you'd have to wad it up and put it in the overhead bin. We could save some time. And Tony Brigman in reservations came to me one day and he said, I wonder if we played music in the jetways, if people would walk faster. So I said, why don't you experiment? So he brought his boom box and his 45 RPM records over to Love Field, sat on a stool on a 100-degree day at Love Field. It was very sophisticated. He'd look at his watch and see how long it was taking people to come down, and he'd play a different song. And he finally found one song that you will walk faster to. It's the Lone Ranger's theme song, the William Tell Overture. Bum, ba, bum, ba, bum, ba, bum, bum. We could gain 20 seconds by playing music in the jetway. And then the final one that helped us until the FAA knocked on my door and said, stop, was that when the last passenger got on the airplane, we would nod to the person down on the push tractor, and they give the airplane about a 2-foot nudge. And it's amazing how quick you'll sit down when you feel the airplane starting to move. But you see, Lamar had a superordinate goal. We've got to sell an airplane, get the productivity up, and turn them in 10 minutes safely. Everybody could understand that superordinate goal. It's kind of like all these things hanging down here from the ceiling. The superordinate goal is at the top. It's the one thing. But everybody that's involved has to know, what's my role in this? So we even gave recipe cards to ramp agents, baggage handlers, saying, here's what you do in minute 1, minute 2, minute 3, minute 4. Spell it out for people. What's their piece of it? And then when that 10-minute turn is completed, they can all look at each other and say, we did it as a team. And that concept works. I can tell you that it works in any industry. But it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. So if you decide to go through the visioning process, figuring out what business you're in, and looking at your culture, you can't do it in a meeting like this and expect everybody to walk out and say, I got it. You got to just get it down one-on-one. I was so sick of that vision statement after a year, I never wanted to see it again. But it's like advertising. About the time I'm sick of it, your customers are just beginning to notice the advertising. And Jim Collins' other point was that it's just as important to tell people what you are not as it is to tell them what you are. Present the value proposition so they know exactly what to expect. Now, Rob told me he started flying Southwest within the last year. And he said, I had to get used to the way you board and so forth. And once I got that figured out, I like it now. So they try to make everything the same, every gate the same, every ABC stanchions are the same. All the seating on the airplane is the same. And to try to make it as easy for you to understand as you can. And the final thing that Southwest has done so well is not charging for baggage. I don't know how much longer they can keep this up, but Gary Kelly told me, this was 6 months ago, that he was getting over $1 billion a year more in revenue because of not charging for bags. And I just saw the other day that they've now upped that to almost $2 billion a year in increased business. I understand the a la carte pricing. I don't like it. I flew Delta the other day to New York, and I'm in their Sky Miles Club, but I'm not at a high enough level, so I forgot. I had to pay $25 to check my bag, and that just stuck in my mind that the next time I have a choice, I'm not going on Delta. And so I could write the president a letter, but it wouldn't do any good. What you see is that all the airlines together last year, they call it ancillary revenue, charging for not only drinks, but baggage and pillows and whatever else. The industry brought in an extra $27 billion in ancillary revenue next year. And Southwest has some. They've done it a little differently. You can get an early bird, so you get a seat number for $10 ahead of other people. But of course, someday it will come if everybody puts in for the early bird, you're going to be right back where you started from. But I hope they can hang on to the no charging for the bags, because I think it really is a big plus for them. And that was the part of the rest of the list, and they're still doing this all today. I can't think of anything they've hardly changed from it. Be specific and clear about who we all are to our stakeholders, investors, vendors, etc. And Jim called it a SMAC, if you remember. Specific, methodical, and consistent. And that's not really what we think of successful companies. We think they're flashy and all this. Southwest really, when you get into it, is pretty routine stuff. It is not rocket science. And there's what's happened with airfares since Southwest Airlines. You probably wouldn't believe this. I mean, you probably in the back can't read it, but just look at the line. Airfares in the USA, adjusted for inflation, are 50% lower than they were in 1979 when airline deregulation started. Now, the little line at the bottom they've started adding in is what's the ancillary revenue going to do to it, and that's going to bring the line back up, but it won't for Southwest. I know you can't read that one, but it's at the United Airlines Continental Stockholders meeting, and he says, now we'll open this to discussion from the floor. We'll be charging $25 per question. And then, of course, the post office, when you talk about a bad vision, he said behind the desk, he says, inform our customers that we're ending Saturday delivery. The first guy says, done. I just emailed them all. And she says, and I just texted them. I only want to tell you one story about Braniff. When we had to put it into bankruptcy, it was the saddest day of my working life after we worked for 7 months to keep this thing alive, 7 days a week, 12, 14 hours a day. And then we finally just ran out of cash. And American was putting so much pressure on us to do, on every route that we flew, they would put flights right on top of us to try to force us down. So we had to make the decision to put it into 11. And we were all tired. Most all of us got the flu. I guess we'd been running on adrenaline for so long, and we just finally ran out of gas. And I got very depressed. I'm usually a pretty positive guy. But I got to feeling sorry for myself. Poor Howard, you're in bankruptcy. Poor Howard, you may never get another job. Poor Howard, you got $1 billion to restructure. Poor Howard, you got 18,000 unsecured creditors. And I began to take my mind off the mission which was to reorganize and restructure. But one morning I had my life-changing experience. I was driving from Plano, Texas to DFW where the offices were, and rather than go on the freeway and risk being seen by media and so forth, because we'd had a lot of attention, I would go down this little back road, 2-lane highway called Highway 121, and I just sort of put my mind in a funk. And I bet all of you in this room have done that, and you pull up to the office and you say, how did I get here? I don't even remember driving here today. It's kind of scary. And I was doing that every day. But I had my life-changing experience. I'm following this big truck that had a big crane built back on the platform. And I wasn't tailgating, fortunately, because his drive shaft broke and fell off and came out from under the truck. So here came this steel missile of about 12 feet long, heading straight for my windshield. So I accelerated, and it went right over the top and landed on the tarmac, the asphalt behind me. And I came out of my funk, and I'm thinking, man, was I lucky when his transmission housing fell off. And this giant glob of steel came, and I hit it and ran over it. Well, he pulls off the side of the road. He didn't have any choice. He didn't have any locomotion. And I pull off beside him, behind him. He gets out. And if you've ever been to Texas, he was the epitome of a good old Texas boy. He was overweight. He had bib overalls on. The buttons were unbuttoned on the side. He had his paint legs stuffed in his boots, had mud all over his boots, had about a 3-day growth of beard and a chaw of tobacco, and a railroad engineer's cap that was on kind of cockeyed. And he gets out of his truck. He didn't even pay attention to me. He just starts walking around this big rig complaining what a bad day he was having. He was stuck in the mud out at McKinney. He's going to be late for the next job. The boss is going to be mad. I got down in my car and looked, and there was a little oil dripping, but nothing too serious. So I went over, and about on his third revolution around his truck, I intercepted him, and I said, why don't you come get in the car with me, and we'll go into Louisville. We'll get a phone. We'll call your boss. You can tell him all your troubles. I want to talk to him and see what kind of insurance you got, and we'll get on with our life. So he gets in the car with me. I'm dressed up. I'm driving. And he starts all over again. What a bad day he's having. Truck was stuck in McKinney, or stuck in the mud, and boss is going to be mad, etc. And finally he looks over at me and he said, hey, Mac, what do you do for a living? I said, I'm the president of Braniff. He said, damn. Thought I was having a bad day. So I went to the office and got the group together and told them the story, and I apologized for me feeling sorry for myself. And I said, let's get this thing reorganized and we can all go have a life again. And we did. It took us about 15 months and we got it to flying again. So set the climate for innovation and for big deals. You are the role models for your people. You and I need role models as well. But you really don't realize what impact you have on your people sometimes, whether you have 2 and 3 in your organization or 3,000 in your organization. They look for the look on your face, the way you walk. Is he or she in a hurry? Are we in trouble? Are things getting worse? I mean, they come up with all these little insinuations, whether they're true or not. Perception becomes reality sometimes. So I've always had the opportunity to have some great role models. I had a lot of mentors. I added them up on an airplane a while back. I've had 18 mentors. And I would say 14 of the 18 never knew that they were my mentor. And that's sort of the best kind of mentoring there is. And all of you go through this. You are mentors to other people. It doesn't have to be formalized. But that gentleman in the center there, that was William A. Patterson. He was the founding president of United Airlines. And this was right after he retired. That's me on his right with the glasses on. That was taken in San Francisco many, many years ago when I was the VP there. But Mr. Patterson, when he retired, made such an impression on all of us at that time The board of directors tried to push a big wad of cash bonus to him on his final board meeting after he retired. And he pushed the wad of cash back. And he said, we have a pension plan. I'm just one of 50,000. I'll take what's coming to me. That belongs to the shareholders. It doesn't belong to me. How many CEOs would do that today? The man had integrity. And I remember riding in a taxi cab with him the same day this picture was taken. And I said, Mr. Patterson, from the time you started the airline back in the late 20s until today in the 70s, what's the biggest thing that's changed? And he said, it's that darn computer. I'm used to making decisions by my gut, and now all those numbers keep coming at me that I have to listen to. If God bless his soul, but think of what he would think if he was here today. And there's another one of my heroes and a mentor. That's Eddie Carlson. Eddie was the co-founder of Western International Hotels in Seattle. And he was also the chairman of the Seattle World's Fair in 1962. He sketched out on a cocktail napkin, again a cocktail napkin, what he thought the Space Needle ought to look like. And he got the idea from the Eiffel Tower when he and his wife Nell were in Paris. He had vision. And when they asked him to be the chairman of the World's Fair, he said on one condition: every meeting will be for breakfast, and it'll be at 6:30 in the morning, and it'll be done at 8 o'clock. And if you want me to run this thing, you're shaking your head. You sound familiar. And if you want me to run that thing, that's the rules. I'm not coming in here for luncheons, dinners, anything to interrupt my workday. But I'll do it at 6:30 to 8. And they said yes, and it was a great success story. Eddie also had a great knack for asking questions and taking notes. And he always carried one of these. It's a little leather folder pouch note taker. And he would carry his in his side coat pocket here. I always carry mine in the back. But whenever he met a passenger or an employee that had an idea or a question, he would whip this thing out and make a note. And so we all started calling it the Ready Eddie, just like drawing a gun. And so I pulled this out a while back somewhere to make a note, and the guy said, "Did you used to work for United Airlines?" And I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "You got your Ready Eddie, I see." But Carlson would get back to the office in Chicago, and he might have 70 or 80 of these little notes that he would give to Marion Levine, his secretary. And she knew what to do with them. She would have them hand-delivered to all of us who were vice presidents. And they were just little, Eddie's handwriting was left-handed like I am. It was very hard to read. But the rules were, Howard, if they're directed in marketing, you have 24 hours to answer that and get me an answer back. I want a handwritten answer. I don't want a typed answer. I don't want you to have a committee meeting. You figure out the answer to this and get it back to me. And then I would take mine down and hand them to Marion Levine, his secretary. Excuse me. And if he didn't like your answer, he would be on the phone asking you, why? Why are we still doing this? When he first came to United Airlines, he said something that I've never forgotten. He said, this industry needs to be deregulated or closed down. Your return on investment is like 1.3%. He said, we'd be better to liquidate the airline and put all the money in the credit union, and we could make 6% at that point in time. Well, that was a pretty disappointing thing to hear from the new CEO. And as he started to leave the room, he said, and by the way, the other thing I think you ought to think about doing is starting an airline within the airline that is Spartan in nature. And he said, he called it Spartan Airlines, which would have been a no-frills Southwest Airlines. And that was probably 2 years before Southwest Airlines ever even went into business. But Eddie Carlson had vision, and he was my mentor without ever knowing it until about a year before he died. And I wrote a magazine article, and I called it Santa Doesn't Always Wear a Red Suit. And I wrote it about Eddie Carlson as to how humble he was and all, and sent it to him and got the nicest letter back. And you know, if you've got a mentor, somebody that's done something for you, let them know how much you appreciate it while they're still alive, rather than wait till we, as we all tend to do, and wait till the funeral, and then we begin to tell stories about that person. He was a true role model. And that was another one of my heroes. That's on the right, on your left. That's Neil Armstrong. And Neil was on the board at United Airlines, and that's how I got to know him. Unfortunately, he passed away last August. But a great American, a great role model, a great patriot. And there's the other end of the spectrum, the last man on the moon, Gene Cernan. Still a good friend, lives in Houston. I called him last Christmas Eve in the afternoon just to wish he and Jan Merry Christmas. And I could tell when he answered his cell phone, he was in the car. And I said, "Where are you going, Captain?" He said, "Oh, Jan ran out of stamps. I got to go to the post office and get Christmas card stamps." And I thought, the last man on the moon has to stand in line like I do to buy a stamp. But a great role model. And when you leave a message on his voice recorder, it says, "I'm sorry, I'm not here to take your call. Call back if you want to." That was a headline in the Myrtle Beach paper a couple of months ago. And they asked some people, "Why should you have a bucket list?" And the guy said, "Because life is not a dress rehearsal." You don't ever get a chance to do it again. So I looked at this airplane one time in Reno, and it occurred to me that airplanes will fly with 2 blades, 3 blades, 4 blades, as long as they're all in balance. But if one blade gets out of balance, you're going to crash and burn. And the same thing can happen to you and to me. And so I drew my own propeller many years ago. Mine says family, work, community, church, and personal. And I still have it hanging up in my home office. And I look at it every once in a while when I go in there in Reno just to ask myself the question, am I out of balance? Am I spending too much time traveling and speaking? Am I staying home too much? Krista says, "Why don't you go travel some more?" But you've all had this when the kids were small and we were all traveling. And then she says, "Where were you when I needed you?" And now she says, "I don't need you." So sometimes she goes with me on these trips, but since this was a quick one, I got to go all the way back to North Carolina tonight. And she always says that she doesn't do one-night stands. So, but balance. So we've just done some crazy things in our lives that was my Christmas present a few years ago, to go drive NASCAR at Charlotte Motor Speedway with Mike, the pilot. And when you're going around a curve at 120 miles an hour, it gives the word focus a whole new meaning. And you forget all your other troubles. It's good to get out of your comfort zone and do something that's different. I think it broadens you. And that was when I jumped. USA Today dared me to do another skydive. We'd done one down in Texas in the years gone by. But I'm hooked on to David Hart there, who's an Army Ranger, was an Army Ranger, and that was the picture that was in USA Today. And I got a lot of emails from friends saying, "Wait a minute, there's only one person in that photograph that doesn't have a helmet. The customer, you. Why?" And I said, "I guess they were short one helmet. I don't know." I do remember when we jumped at 13,000 feet, I thought, if the chute doesn't open, a helmet's not going to make a heck of a lot of difference anyway. But I took our daughter Sue with us on that one. And so that was something we could bond and do together as well. I saw that bumper sticker one time down in Tampa, Florida. "Are you really the person your dog thinks you are?" Whenever you go home at night and that tail is wagging, that little dog doesn't know whether you've had a bad day, whether you did a good job, a bad job, but it's always there to inspire you. And the little dog on the right, that's Lady Galala. Belongs to a Southwest flight attendant. And she'd taken the little dog out to the Galleria shopping, and I guess the dog got pretty tired, so he's on the way home. It was on her Christmas card. Oops, hit the wrong button. And that's our little dog, Dolly, named after Dolly Parton. Here's something I do, and I offer it to you. I started writing a weekly email, 7 years ago, I guess. And you can go to my website, to putnam.com, and sign up. It's free. There's no charge. There's no gimmicks. I don't sell anything. But I know we have several thousand, 5,000, 6,000 people that get it every week. If you haven't done something like this for your employees or for your customers, think about it. And I know blogs are great, Facebook and all the social media. I'm on that, but I don't spend as much time on it. But the email still comes to you, and you don't have to go somewhere and look for it. And it's just 2 or 3 paragraphs every week, something about leadership, something about ethics, something about integrity. And you're welcome to use it, plagiarize the stuff, and put it in your own email, whatever you want to do. But I think it's important you just keep pulling it together. So, before we do Q&A and I bring this to a close, just think about what I was trying to get across here. Leadership through turbulent times. There are strategies to make it work in any industry. You can be prepared to do it, though. Misery is an option. Misery is inevitable, but turbulence is inevitable, misery is optional. Look for the positive side in that thing. The people, the vision, what business are you really in? What's the culture? Like the culture, every organization has a culture, just like ABI. So thinking of all that together, I asked my friend Art Holst a couple of years ago, who writes poetry, used to be a National Football League official, and he's a great speaker. And I said, Art, someday would you write me a little poem that I could use to close presentations on occasion? And Art has a very deep, gruff voice, and he said, what do you want it to be about? And I said, well, something about the future, something about aviation, space, something about integrity, technology, balance, something like that. So he went off in a corner, and 20 minutes later he came back and handed me a yellow sheet of paper. And this is what he had written on it. And he called it To the Stars. Over 100 years have passed since Orville Wilbur Wright, upon the sands of Kitty Hawk, made that monumental flight. But in our eternal searching to make things better soon, we've gone from Kitty Hawk to Lindbergh to Armstrong and Cernan on the moon. But now we look beyond those clouds to travel to the stars. And balance is the partner of technology and schemes. And dedicated people make reality out of dreams. So as we close this session, a final thought I have to share. How you perceive the future will chart the course to get you there. Thank you. God bless America.